Imagine buying a first-class ticket, showing up early, sitting where you belong, and still being told you don't deserve that seat. That's exactly what happened to Ava Williams, a black woman CEO, moments before takeoff. A white passenger claimed her seat and demanded she move. And when she refused, the entire plane went silent. But what no one knew was that this single act of quiet defiance would ground the entire flight, spark a global conversation, and transform an industry forever. This isn't just a story about discrimination. It's a story about dignity. A story about how one woman's calm became more powerful than rage. How a moment of humiliation turned into history. So stay till the end, because the lesson Ava left behind will make you rethink what real power sounds like. Sometimes strength doesn't shout. Sometimes it simply stays seated. You're watching BrainFuel, where real stories spark real change. Stories that challenge what's wrong, celebrate what's right, and remind you what humanity truly means. If you believe one act of courage can still change the world, then don't blink, because this story will prove it. The boarding gate buzzed with noise, rolling suitcases, impatient sighs, and the rhythmic call of flight attendants announcing final boarding. It was one of those evenings when the airport felt like its own tiny world. People rushing home, some heading for business, some for dreams, and others just running away from something. Among the crowd stood Ava Williams, her calmness a striking contrast to the chaos around her. She wasn't just another traveler. Her quiet confidence, sharp posture, and effortless grace made her stand out, like someone who didn't need to say much to command respect. She wore a tailored black suit that fit her perfectly, her hair tied neatly, a watch on her wrist gleaming under the airport lights. Ava was the CEO of a fast-growing tech company, one that had started in a tiny apartment with only 2 people and a borrowed laptop. In just 6 years, she had turned it into a multi-million-dollar business that developed software helping small businesses grow online. She had been featured in Forbes, spoken at global conferences, and mentored hundreds of young women to believe that leadership had no color. But today, Ava wasn't thinking about business or success. She was exhausted. She had just spent 2 long days at a major business summit in Chicago, giving speeches, attending meetings, and networking nonstop. The event had gone incredibly well. She'd even been offered collaboration with one of the biggest companies in Silicon Valley. Yet all she wanted now was silence. The flight back home to Atlanta was her small window of peace, a few hours where she could breathe, think, and maybe close her eyes before diving back into her next round of responsibilities. She had upgraded to first class, not out of vanity, but because she needed space, both literally and mentally. When her boarding group was called, she moved with calm precision. No rush, no fuss, just quiet composure. The flight attendant scanned her ticket and smiled warmly. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Williams. You're in seat 2A right up front." Ava returned the smile. "Thank you." As she walked down the aisle, she could feel a few curious eyes on her. It wasn't unusual. People often noticed her, not because of fame, but because she carried herself differently. Confidence without arrogance. Power without ego. She placed her carry-on in the overhead bin, her movements graceful and deliberate. She had learned long ago that in rooms where she didn't look like everyone else, boardrooms, conferences, or flights full of executives, composure was her quiet weapon. As she reached her row, she stopped. Her seat, 2A, was already occupied. A white man, maybe in his late 40s, sat there comfortably, scrolling on his phone as if the seat had always been his. His suit was slightly wrinkled, his tie loosened, and a half-empty cup of coffee rested on the armrest. Ava looked at the seat number again. Yes, it was definitely hers. At first, she thought maybe it was an innocent mistake. People often sat in the wrong seat by accident. So she smiled politely and said, "Excuse me, I think you might be in my seat. 2A. The man didn't even glance up. He kept scrolling through his phone, muttering, "I don't think so." His tone wasn't confused or apologetic. It was dismissive, almost irritated, as if she had interrupted something more important. Ava paused for a moment, keeping her voice calm. "Yes, I'm sure. My ticket says 2A. That's when he finally looked at her. His eyes scanned her quickly. The dark skin, the tailored suit, the calm expression, and then he smirked a cold, condescending grin. "Are you sure you're not mistaken?" he said slowly, like he was talking to someone who couldn't quite understand. "This is first class." For a second, Ava didn't react. She had dealt with subtle comments like that her whole career, the kind that came wrapped in a smile but carried poison underneath. But hearing it in such a public place still stung. "Yes," she replied firmly. "I'm aware, and that's where my seat is." He chuckled quietly, shaking his head as if amused. "You're probably in economy. Check your ticket again. They mix things up sometimes." Ava's patience started to thin, but she stayed composed. She opened her purse, pulled out her ticket, and held it where he could clearly see. Seat 2A, first class. The man leaned slightly forward, glanced at it, then leaned back again with a smirk. "Must be a mistake," he said. "There's no way." A few nearby passengers turned their heads, sensing tension. Some looked curious, others uncomfortable. Ava could feel the air shift, that quiet, invisible pressure that comes when people are watching but no one wants to speak. In her head, Ava reminded herself, "Stay calm. You've handled worse." Her whole life had been about breaking barriers and proving wrong the people who thought success had a skin color. But she was tired of having to prove it. She just wanted to sit in the seat she paid for. Still standing. She tried one last time, her voice steady but cold now. "I'm not mistaken. This is my seat, and I'd like to sit down." The man sighed loudly, looking around as if he were the one being inconvenienced. "Fine," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You can call the attendant if it makes you feel better." Ava took a deep breath. She could have argued, but she chose not to. Instead, she raised her hand slightly to get the flight attendant's attention. The young woman walked over with a friendly smile that quickly faded when she saw the situation. "Is there a problem?" Before Ava could speak, the man jumped in. "Yeah, she's trying to take my seat. I've flown this route for years. Maybe she's confused." Ava's jaw tightened. She handed her ticket to the attendant and said softly, "This is my seat. 2A." The attendant looked at both tickets and frowned. She hesitated, just for a moment, but Ava saw it, that small flicker of uncertainty, not about the seat numbers, but about who to believe. And in that tiny pause, Ava felt something she hadn't in years, humiliation trying to creep in. She straightened her shoulders, her voice like quiet steel. "Please check your manifest," she said. "You'll see who's supposed to be here." The attendant nodded, but the man smirked again, whispering just loud enough for Ava to hear. "You people always think you deserve more than you do." The words hit like a slap, not just to her, but to everything she had worked for. And in that moment, the atmosphere in the cabin changed. The whispers began. Phones subtly lifted to record. Ava didn't flinch. She just stood there, calm, proud, unshaken, staring at the man who had no idea who he was dealing with. Because in the next few minutes, his arrogance would not only cost him his dignity, but would bring the entire flight to a halt. The cabin had gone silent. That heavy silence when everyone knows something's wrong, but pretend to be busy with their phones or seatbelts. The man sitting in Ava's seat looked entirely comfortable, like he owned the place. He scrolled through his phone lazily, the faint glow lighting up his smirk. Ava stood there, her hand still gripping the back of the seat in front of her. Inside, her heart beat faster than she wanted to admit. Not because she was afraid. No, Ava Williams didn't scare easily, but because she knew exactly what kind of situation this was turning into. She had seen it before, in boardrooms, at conferences, even at five-star hotels. The kind of moment where her success, her dignity, and even her right to exist in a certain space were silently questioned. But Ava wasn't about to let that happen here. Not today. Not again. "Sir," she said, her voice steady, "as I mentioned before, this is my seat." The man finally set his phone down, leaned back, and crossed his legs. His expression was pure arrogance, the kind that comes from being too used to getting away with things. "You really think I'm just sitting in someone else's seat on purpose?" he asked, almost laughing. "I think mistakes happen," Ava replied coolly, refusing to play into his tone. "But right now you're sitting in mine." He chuckled again, shaking his head. "Listen, sweetheart, The word hit her like nails on glass. Sweetheart. That casual, dismissive tone men use when they want to talk down to women. And in his voice, it carried an extra layer of poison. I've been flying first class for over a decade, he continued, leaning forward slightly. This is my regular route. Maybe your ticket got mixed up. Happens all the time, especially when people aren't used to... He stopped himself mid-sentence, but the smirk said everything he didn't finish out loud. Ava's lips curved slightly, not in a smile, but in disbelief. She could feel a few passengers watching from behind their newspapers, pretending not to. A man 2 rows back adjusted his phone camera discreetly. Another woman whispered something to her husband. The air was thick with quiet judgment and curiosity. She took a small breath, grounding herself. I'm not new to flying, sir, she said, her voice calm but sharp as glass. Now, if you don't mind. Before she could finish, the flight attendant returned. She was young, probably in her mid-20s, with a nervous smile plastered on her face, the kind of smile airline staff use when they can tell something bad is about to happen. Is there a problem here? She asked, looking between them. Ava opened her mouth to answer, but once again, the man jumped in first. Yes, actually, he said quickly, feigning annoyance. This woman's trying to take my seat. I've got 2A. Been flying this route for years. The attendant blinked, caught off guard. Oh, Ava held out her boarding pass. This is my ticket, she said firmly. Seat 2A, first class. The flight attendant took the ticket, glancing at it before turning to the man. Sir, may I see yours as well? He sighed dramatically, as though he were the one being inconvenienced. Fine, he said, fishing through his jacket pocket. He handed over his boarding pass with an exaggerated movement, like he was doing them a favor. The attendant looked at both tickets, her brows furrowing. Ava could see the confusion flicker across her face. That hesitation, that moment where she wasn't sure who to believe. It was subtle, but Ava had seen 1,000 times before. Finally, the attendant looked up. Both of these tickets say seat 2A, she said carefully. The man smiled smugly, spreading his arms slightly as if to say, see? I told you so. Ava frowned, shaking her head. That's impossible. The attendant forced another smile. Let me just step aside and verify this with the system. Ava nodded, but the man couldn't resist one more jab. You know, he said loudly enough for others to hear, they really need to start checking tickets more carefully before upgrades. Happens all the time. The word stung not because they were cruel, but because of what they implied. People like you don't belong here. Ava didn't reply. She just stood still, her eyes fixed on the seat she rightfully owned. Inside, she was reminding herself who she was. The CEO of a company employing over 400 people, a woman who built everything from scratch. Yet, somehow, to this stranger, none of that mattered. The attendant returned a moment later, looking flustered. Sir, she said, there must have been a printing error. The system shows this seat belongs to Ms. Williams. The man's smugness vanished instantly, his jaw clenched. That can't be right, he snapped. Check again. I did, she replied. Your seat is in 14C. A ripple of quiet gasps moved through the cabin. A man across the aisle shook his head. A young woman near the window whispered, 14C? That economy. The man's face flushed red. He gripped his armrest, his voice rising. This is absurd. I always fly first class. I paid for it. The attendant kept her tone firm. Sir, I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but you'll need to move to your assigned seat. But instead of moving, he doubled down. No, I'm not moving anywhere. I was told this was my seat. She's clearly mistaken. He pointed at Ava with the kind of disrespectful wave you'd use to dismiss someone entirely. Ava didn't flinch. She just looked him straight in the eyes. It's over, sir. You're sitting in my seat, and the system confirms it. He glared at her, his voice dripping with venom. You think you're better than everyone because of that fancy suit? Because you got lucky once. Ava said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any argument. The flight attendant took a step closer, her patience finally cracking. Sir, you need to move now. You're delaying boarding. But he didn't. He stayed seated, arms crossed, face burning with anger and embarrassment. Passengers began to murmur louder now, some recording openly. The situation had shifted. What started as subtle tension was now a public scene. Ava turned away slightly, focusing on her breathing. She refused to let him see her frustration. Deep down, she knew people like him thrived on reaction. Sir, the attendant warned, her voice sharper now, if you refuse to move, we'll have to call security. That's when his composure cracked completely. He slammed his phone on the armrest, shouting, "This is unbelievable. I'm not going anywhere." Gasps filled the air. A baby started crying somewhere in the back. The tension spread through the cabin like wildfire. Ava stood still, her expression calm, collected, untouchable. Because she knew this wasn't over. And the moment justice arrived, the world would see exactly who was in the wrong. And for the man in seat 2A, the next few minutes would become the most humiliating flight experience of his life. The air inside the plane grew heavy, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. You could almost hear the tension, even to the faint hum of the engines and the overhead announcements. Ava stood tall beside her seat, her calm expression masking the storm brewing inside. The man in 2A, red-faced and defensive, sat stubbornly with his arms crossed, glaring ahead as if sheer willpower could make the problem disappear. The young flight attendant, still clearly shaken, looked between them, unsure what to do. Her eyes flicked toward the front of the cabin where the senior flight attendant, a woman in her 50s with the kind of authority that came from decades of experience, was walking briskly down the aisle. Passengers were whispering now. Some had their phones tilted slightly, recording. Others exchanged quiet looks that said, "I can't believe this is happening." The older attendant stopped in front of them, her voice firm but professional. "What seems to be the issue here?" Before Ava could speak, the man jumped in, his words spilling out like fire. "She's trying to take my seat. I've already told her this is my ticket. I've been flying this route for years. You people have some serious system errors going on." Ava turned to the attendant, her voice steady and polite. "Ma'am, my boarding pass says 2A. The system confirmed it. He's sitting in my seat and refusing to move." The older attendant nodded slightly, trying to defuse the situation. "All right, let's take a deep breath. Sir, may I please see your ticket?" The man handed it over with a sharp motion. She examined it for a moment, then checked Ava's. Her eyes moved between the two tickets, then to her tablet. Her expression changed almost instantly, the quiet, professional mask slipping for a fraction of a second into something more serious. "Sir," she said carefully, "you are assigned to seat 14C. That's toward the back of the plane." A wave of murmurs rolled through the cabin. Someone snickered softly. Another passenger whispered, "14C? That's economy." The man's jaw tightened. "That's not possible," he snapped. "I paid for first class." "I understand you're frustrated," the attendant replied, keeping her voice calm. "But the manifest is clear. Seat 2A belongs to Ms. Williams." He slammed his palm against the armrest. "This is ridiculous. You can't seriously expect me to move now. The flight's about to take off." The older attendant's patience was thinning. Her tone sharpened. "Sir, if you don't comply, we'll have to delay the flight. Please gather your belongings and take your assigned seat." But instead of complying, the man did something that made the entire plane freeze. He turned toward Ava, his voice low but dripping with venom. "You must think you're so special. Huh? Probably pulled some strings to get up here. Don't act like you deserve this seat." Ava felt every eye in the cabin snap toward her. The words hung in the air, heavy and ugly. She didn't speak right away. She just looked at him, steady, unshaken, almost pitying. Because what could you even say to someone like that? Then, in the calmest tone imaginable, she replied, "You have no idea what I deserve." That one line, quiet, composed, powerful, was like a slap made of silk. The passengers watching could feel it. A few even nodded subtly, impressed by her poise. The man's face twisted with anger. "You people think you can just walk in anywhere and get treated the same as the rest of us. That's the problem these days. Gasps erupted from the rows behind them. The young attendant's face went pale. "Sir, that's enough," she said quickly, her voice trembling. But the older attendant didn't flinch. She stepped forward, her voice cold and commanding. "Sir, you need to stop speaking immediately or I'll have to involve the captain." He scoffed, shaking his head. "Oh, please. What's the captain going to do? Kick me off because of her?" Ava still hadn't raised her voice once. She just stood there, calm, unmovable, dignified, while the man's behavior grew more pathetic by the second. Passengers were openly filming now. One woman whispered, "She's handling this better than anyone I've ever seen." The attendant pressed the intercom button near the galley. "Captain, this is lead cabin. We have a non-compliant passenger in first class." The color drained from the man's face for a second. "You're calling the captain? For this?" "Yes, sir," she said flatly. "You've left us no choice." The intercom clicked off. The tension in the cabin was unbearable now. Everyone sitting upright, eyes darting between the man and Ava. The young attendant returned with another crew member, both ready to intervene if things got worse. Ava finally sat down in her seat, crossing her legs with quiet authority. She didn't say another word. She didn't need to. The flight attendant's decision had already said everything for her. The man remained standing in the aisle, torn between pride and humiliation. He looked down at her, his voice trembling with rage. "This isn't over. You'll regret this." Ava turned her head slightly, met his gaze, and said softly, "No, I won't." Her tone was calm, but her eyes, sharp and fearless, told a different story. At that moment, the captain's voice came over the intercom, his tone calm but serious. "Cabin crew, please hold all doors. I'll be coming out shortly." The man swallowed hard. His confidence cracked just a little. The older attendant crossed her arms, waiting. "Sir," she said again, "you have one final chance to take your assigned seat before we escalate this further." But pride is a dangerous thing. The man clenched his jaw, grabbed his bag roughly, and threw it over his shoulder. "Fine, I'll move, but this airline's going to hear from me." He stormed toward the back of the plane, muttering under his breath. The entire cabin followed him with their eyes, some shaking their heads, others rolling them. As he disappeared down the aisle, a quiet murmur spread. Someone whispered, "Good riddance." Another passenger said, "That woman has more grace than I ever could." The older attendant turned to Ava, her voice soft now. "Ma'am, I'm deeply sorry for that. You handled yourself incredibly well." Ava offered a small, tired smile. "It's all right. Thank you for stepping in." The attendant nodded respectfully before returning to the front. The younger one gave Ava a gentle smile, her eyes full of admiration. As Ava finally settled into her seat, fastening her belt, she stared out the window, not angry, not shaken, just thoughtful. Because for her, this wasn't just about a seat. It was about a pattern, a story she'd lived too many times before. But she also knew something else. Moments like these, when handled with calm strength, could speak louder than 1,000 speeches. She adjusted her jacket, took a slow breath, and closed her eyes. She didn't know it yet, but before this flight even left the runway, the world was about to see her story. And the man who tried to humiliate her, he was about to learn that arrogance always crashes harder than any plane ever could. The cabin lights had dimmed slightly as boarding neared completion, but the air inside that plane felt electric, charged with whispers, side glances, and quiet judgment. Everyone had seen the confrontation. Everyone had heard the man's words. But now, with him still refusing to leave completely and murmuring angrily from the aisle, the energy had shifted from shock to unease. Ava sat in her rightful seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face unreadable. On the outside, she was the image of composure. Inside, though, her thoughts raced. She'd handled difficult negotiations with billion-dollar investors. She'd stared down competitors who tried to undermine her. Yet something about this moment felt heavier. It wasn't business, it was dignity. She heard footsteps and looked up. The younger flight attendant returned, holding a small tablet and wearing a strange smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her name tag read Megan. "Ma'am," Megan began softly, leaning closer. "Would you mind stepping into the aisle for just a moment while we double-check everything? It'll only take a second." Ava blinked. "I'm sorry? You want me to move again?" "It's just so we can make sure everything's settled," Megan said quickly, glancing nervously toward a man who stood a few rows away pretending to check his bag, but obviously listening. "We need to confirm the manifest with the gate agent." Ava's voice stayed calm but firmer now. "You already confirmed it. This is my seat." Megan hesitated. "I understand, ma'am, but the passenger's upset, and we don't want any more commotion before takeoff." Ava tilted her head slightly. "So, instead of asking him to calm down, you're asking me to move?" Again, Megan's cheeks flushed. "It's just protocol." Passengers nearby shifted in their seats. They heard every word. A middle-aged woman in 2B, sitting beside Ava, frowned and muttered, "That's not right." Ava gave a small, tired smile to the woman before turning back to the attendant. "Protocol," she repeated quietly. "Or convenience?" Megan didn't answer. Her eyes darted toward the galley, hoping her supervisor would appear and rescue her from the uncomfortable moment. Ava exhaled slowly. She could have stood up just to avoid the argument, but she'd spent too many years politely stepping aside for other people's comfort. "Not today. I'm not moving," she said finally. "You have everything you need to confirm. Please handle it from there." Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a certain weight, the kind of steady authority that fills a room without needing to rise above a whisper. Megan froze. Around them, the quiet hum of the aircraft returned, underscored by the tapping of the man's foot in the aisle. The man turned toward the attendant, raising his voice again. "See? She's making this difficult. I told you this airline's a joke." Megan's discomfort deepened. "Sir, please." He cut her off. "No, you please. I paid good money for this seat, and I'm not going back there with those kids and crying babies." Ava folded her hands tighter, fighting the urge to roll her eyes. She'd learned long ago that sometimes silence was the sharpest response. That's when the senior flight attendant, Ms. Lawson, returned, carrying authority like armor. Her calm voice sliced through the tension. "Mr. Bradley, we verified the manifest twice. Seat 2A belongs to Ms. Williams. You'll need to sit in 14C, or we'll ask security to assist you." The man glared at her. "You're taking her side now?" Lawson's tone didn't waver. "I'm taking the side of the airline's records, sir." Still, his defiance didn't fade. "You're making a huge mistake." He looked at Ava again, his lips curling. "You must really think you've won something, huh?" Ava met his gaze coolly. "I didn't come here to win. I came here to sit." The line was so simple, yet it rippled through the cabin like applause no one dared to give. Megan looked between them, her nerves unraveling. She whispered to Ms. Lawson, "Maybe we can just move Ms. Williams temporarily." Lawson's eyes snapped toward her. "No, we will not. She's where she belongs." For the first time, Ava saw the younger attendant shrink a little, as though realizing how her suggestion had sounded out loud. Bias didn't always show its face in hatred. Sometimes it wore the mask of avoiding trouble. Passengers began murmuring softly. A man in the third row leaned toward his wife. "They really try to move her? That's crazy." Another passenger spoke up just loud enough. "If she were anyone else, this wouldn't even be a debate." Ava could feel the energy shifting again, this time in her favor. What had started as a quiet humiliation was turning into a public reckoning. Ms. Lawson raised her hand, signaling for silence. "Everyone, please stay seated. We're resolving this immediately." She turned back to the man. "Sir, final warning. Either you take your assigned seat, or the captain will have you escorted off this aircraft." He opened his mouth to argue, but Ms. Lawson's expression left no room for negotiation. With a muttered curse, he grabbed his bag and stomped toward the back, brushing past other passengers. The sound of his footsteps echoed like thunder, fading down the aisle. When he was gone, Megan exhaled shakily. "Thank you, Ms. Lawson." The older woman gave her a firm look. "Megan, don't ever ask the wrong passenger to move again. We're here to protect fairness, not convenience. Understand?" Megan nodded quickly, eyes lowered. Ava sat quietly, looking out the window again. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt Tired. Tired of how familiar it all was. The disbelief, the hesitation, the polite request to step aside. It was a script she'd lived too many times. The woman beside her leaned over, whispering, "You handle that beautifully. Most people would have lost it." Ava smiled faintly. "If I did, he'd just use that as proof that I didn't belong here." The woman nodded knowingly. "Well, you definitely showed him who did." Ava chuckled softly, though her heart was still heavy. She thought about all the young women watching those recordings right now, all the strangers on this flight who'd seen her composure tested in public. Maybe, just maybe, this moment could mean more than just a stolen seat. Ms. Lawson returned a few minutes later with a warm towel and a quiet apology. "Ma'am, on behalf of the crew, I'm truly sorry for the way this unfolded. I appreciate your patience." Ava nodded graciously. "Thank you. You handled it well in the end." The older woman smiled, a little sadly. "I wish it didn't take so long for people to see the truth." Ava looked out the window again, the city lights fading as the plane began taxiing toward the runway. "It usually does," she murmured, as the engines roared to life. Ava closed her eyes, finally allowing herself to breathe. Around her, the tension slowly melted away. Passengers returned to their conversations, but the memory of what they'd witnessed lingered like an invisible echo in the cabin. No one said out loud, but everyone knew. They'd just seen something far bigger than a seating dispute. They'd seen what quiet strength looked like when the world tried to make it sit somewhere else. And while the younger attendant still avoided Ava's gaze, somewhere deep down, she'd learned a lesson that would follow her every time she put on that uniform again. Because fairness isn't just a rule in the manual. It's a choice, and Ava Williams had reminded them all what it looked like to choose it, even when others didn't. The plane finally began to taxi toward the runway, and for the first time since boarding, the cabin seemed to exhale. The hum of the engines filled the air, the softening of seatbelt signs echoed overhead, and flight attendants walked briskly through the aisle to make final checks. But Ava sat there, still and thoughtful, her hands resting on her lap as she stared out the oval window. The lights of the airport drifted by like tiny fireflies, beautiful, distant, and untouchable. She should have felt relief that it was over, that she'd kept her seat and her dignity, but something inside her felt unfinished. The man's words still rang in her ears. The way Megan had asked her to move still burned in her chest. As the plane turned toward the runway, she whispered to herself, "Just breathe, Ava, it's done." But the universe wasn't done. From somewhere in the back of the aircraft, a voice rose. Sharp, angry, familiar. It was him, Mr. Bradley. Passengers turned as his voice grew louder. "This is ridiculous. I've flown this airline for years, and now I'm treated like garbage because of some computer glitch." Ms. Lawson's calm but stern voice responded, though it carried only partway through the plane. "Sir, please lower your voice. You are disturbing other passengers." Ava's pulse quickened. She could hear movement, scuffling, raised tones. Then came the announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've been instructed to return to the gate for a short delay. Please remain seated." A murmur swept through the cabin. People groaned, sighed, and exchanged frustrated looks. Ava frowned, glancing toward Ms. Lawson, who was already walking briskly to the rear. Something in her posture said this wasn't just about a short delay. The engine slowed. The aircraft turned away from the runway lights, heading back toward the terminal. "What's going on?" asked the woman beside Ava. "I don't know," Ava said quietly, though part of her did. Moments later, the truth revealed itself. The man had refused to sit down in his assigned seat, even after multiple warnings. He continued shouting, recording himself on his phone, ranting about reverse discrimination and unfair treatment. When Ms. Lawson told him he'd need to leave the aircraft, he'd snapped. "I'm not going anywhere. You think you can humiliate me in front of everyone? You'll regret this." That was it. The captain had been notified. The plane couldn't legally take off with a non-compliant passenger on board. As the aircraft slowed to a stop near the gate, a heavy silence fell across the cabin. And then Two airport security officers appeared at the front. The tension was so thick you could feel it in your teeth. One officer quietly said, "Sir, please collect your belongings and step off the aircraft." But the man didn't move. "This is ridiculous. I'm not leaving." "Sir, we can escort you peacefully or we can remove you," the officer warned. He looked around the cabin, seeking sympathy, but all he found were cold stares and camera phones pointed in his direction. Even the same people who'd looked uncertain before now watched silently, united in disbelief. Ava sat perfectly still. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't even blink. She simply watched as Karma did his work, quiet, steady, and absolute. After another warning, the man finally grabbed his bag, muttering curses under his breath. As he passed Ava's row, he slowed down, his jaw clenched. For a moment, their eyes met again. "You happy now?" he hissed. Ava's reply was calm, but her words cut through the noise like glass. "I was happy the moment I chose not to let you steal my peace." He scoffed, but there was no power left in him. Security guided him down the aisle, and moments later, he was gone. The door shut behind him. A hush fell over the cabin. Then a single clap. It came from somewhere in the middle row. Then another, and another. Within seconds, half the plane was applauding. Ava's eyes widened slightly. She hadn't expected that. Ms. Lawson, standing in the front, gave her a warm, proud nod before speaking into the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We'll be departing shortly. Please remain seated while we resecure the cabin." The applause faded, but the mood had changed. The quiet respect in the air was something you could feel. The kind of collective realization that happens when people finally see how wrong something was and how right someone handled it. The woman beside Ava turned to her. "You see that? That's what happens when you stand up for yourself. You didn't just win a seat. You made a point." Ava smiled faintly. "I don't want a point. I just wanted fairness." "Sometimes," the woman said softly, "they're the same thing." As the engines roared to life again, Ava leaned back in her seat. She looked calm, but deep down she was trembling, not from fear, but from release. The kind that comes when you realize the fight is finally over and you never lost your grace. Megan, the younger flight attendant, reappeared beside her. She looked pale, nervous. "Ms. Williams," she said quietly, "I wanted to apologize. I shouldn't have asked you to move earlier. That wasn't right." Ava looked up at her, studying her expression. There was sincerity in the girl's eyes, maybe even shame. "Thank you," Ava said simply. "It takes character to admit that." Megan nodded, relief washing over her face. "I learned something today. I really did." Ava gave her a kind smile. Then it was worth it. The engine surged again, the lights dimmed, and the plane began its second taxi, this time toward takeoff for real. As they lifted into the night sky, Ava watched the city lights shrink below. She thought about everything that had just happened, how a simple seat dispute had revealed so much about the world. To some, it would just be a flight delay. But to her, and to everyone who'd witnessed it, it was something deeper, a small victory in a much bigger story about respect, equality, and the quiet power of self-control. She closed her eyes, finally at peace. Somewhere behind her, passengers whispered softly, not gossip, but admiration. She handled that better than anyone I've ever seen. She didn't even raise her voice. I'm going to remember that woman for a long time. And though Ava didn't hear them, she could feel it. That ripple of respect that follows truth. The plane soared higher, cutting through the clouds. She reached for her phone and opened her notes app, typing quietly. Grace is power. Always. She smiled at her own words and locked the screen. A few rows away, Megan glanced back at her again, as if imprinting her face into memory, a reminder that strength doesn't need to shout to be heard. And miles below, on the tarmac, security escorted a man still mumbling about injustice, unaware that the only injustice that happened tonight was the one he tried to cause. By the time the plane touched down in New York, the world outside had already begun to spin. Ava didn't know it yet, but while she sat quietly sipping her ginger ale and jotting notes on her phone, Half a dozen passengers on that flight had already posted clips of the confrontation online. The videos weren't long, just 30-40 seconds each, but they captured everything that mattered. The man's angry outburst, Ava's calm composure, Ms. Lawson's firm defense, and finally, the moment security escorted him off the plane to a wave of applause. By the time Ava's flight taxied to the gate, the internet had already chosen its hero. On X Twitter, one caption read, "Black woman politely refuses to give up her seat. Watch what happens next. Iconic." On TikTok, another clip had over 1.2 million views in just 3 hours. She didn't even raise her voice. That's power. And on Instagram, someone had already turned it into a motivational reel with music under her calm, powerful words. "I didn't come here to win. I came here to sit." That single line became a viral quote overnight, printed on memes, shirts, and captions across the internet. But Ava had no idea. When she finally exited the plane, she smiled politely at Ms. Lawson and Megan, thanked them for their professionalism, and stepped into the terminal. She was tired, not just from the flight, but from the emotional weight of the confrontation. Her driver, a quiet man named Joseph, met her near baggage claim. "Rough flight, ma'am?" he asked as he loaded her suitcase into the trunk. Ava gave a small chuckle. Let's just say eventful. She climbed into the back seat, closed her eyes, and exhaled deeply. By the time she reached her hotel in Manhattan, her phone was buzzing with dozens of notifications. Texts from colleagues, missed calls, emails marked urgent. At first, she ignored them. She just wanted to rest. But curiosity eventually won. She unlocked her phone. The first message was from her assistant, Tina. "Ava, you okay? You're literally trending. Call me ASAP." Her brow furrowed. Trending? She opened X and froze. Hashtag Ava Williams was the #1 trending hashtag in the U.S. Thousands of posts, hundreds of clips, endless comments. She tapped one of the videos, the same moment she'd lived just hours earlier, playing now in front of millions. She watched herself calm, collected, refusing to move. Watched as she said those words. "I didn't come here to win. I came here to sit." The crowd's applause echoed faintly through the clip. Her heart skipped a beat. Below the video were comments pouring in every second. "Queen energy. She handled that like a boss. Grace under fire. Absolute inspiration. This woman deserves all the respect in the world." Ava covered her mouth, stunned. She wasn't used to this kind of attention. As the CEO of Nuvexa Technologies, a rapidly growing health tech startup, she was used to staying behind the scenes, leading, not trending. But that was no longer possible, because one user had already connected the dots. Someone tweeted, "Wait, that's Ava Williams?" The CEO who spoke at the Global Tech Summit last year. And just like that, the story exploded all over again. Articles began appearing within hours. CEO refuses to give up seat. Teaches a lesson in grace and power. When composure becomes leadership, the viral story of Ava Williams. Meet the woman whose calm defiance stopped a flight. Her company's website crashed from the sudden surge of visitors. Journalists called. Podcasts reached out. Morning talk shows requested interviews. Even celebrities began chiming in. "That woman is a lesson in class," wrote an actress on Instagram. "We need more leaders like Ava Williams," tweeted a popular business influencer. Within 24 hours, the story had gone global, but not everyone reacted the same way. In certain corners of the internet, the man, now identified as Tom Bradley, a sales executive from Ohio, tried to defend himself. He gave a statement claiming he'd been unfairly treated and that the situation was exaggerated. But it was too late. The videos spoke for themselves. In one particularly damning clip, you could hear him muttering something under his breath that many interpreted as racially charged. The backlash was swift. His company released a statement the next day confirming he'd been terminated for conduct inconsistent with our values. Meanwhile, Ava stayed silent. She didn't post. She didn't respond. She didn't even give interviews. For her, it wasn't about revenge or publicity. She didn't want to turn a painful moment into a spectacle. But the world was moved by her silence, her composure, The same calmness that had frustrated her opponent became her most powerful voice. People began calling her the woman whose Saturday. Some said she reminded them of Rosa Parks, a modern echo of quiet defiance in a new setting. Others called her the embodiment of dignity in the digital age. A week later, Ava finally released a short public statement. It wasn't long. No press conference, no dramatic video. Just a simple message posted on her company's official page. To everyone who's reached out, thank you for your kindness. What happened on that flight was not new, nor is it rare, but I hope it reminds us that grace under pressure is not weakness, it's power. Sometimes, standing up for yourself simply means staying seated. That last line broke the internet all over again. Within minutes, it became a new wave of inspiration. People quoted it in speeches, shared it with their daughters, and wrote it on sticky notes at work. Even major news outlets picked it up, calling it the most elegant statement of the year. Behind the spotlight, though, Ava stayed grounded. She continued her work quietly, pouring her energy back into her company's mission, building affordable health tech for underprivileged communities. But something had shifted. At her next investor meeting, a board member told her, "You know, that flight story, it showed the world exactly who you are. You didn't just lead your company. You led a moment." Ava smiled humbly. "I didn't plan to lead anything," she said. "I just refused to shrink." And perhaps that was why people love her story so much. Because it wasn't rehearsed. It was raw, real, and human. It reminded the world that true strength doesn't come from shouting or fighting or demanding attention. It comes from knowing your worth and holding your ground when others try to take it. For Ava, it had just been another exhausting flight. For the world, it became a symbol, one that proved that dignity doesn't need an audience to shine. But when it does find one, it can light up the entire sky. The morning after Ava's post went live, New York City woke up buzzing, not with traffic, but with talk of her. Every news screen and every cafe replayed the same clip. Ava Williams sitting calmly on that plane, the man shouting the applause the moment the flight turned around. Cable anchors spoke with the kind of excitement reserved for breaking scandals and heroes. Was it discrimination or just airline chaos? Who was the mysterious CEO who handled it all so gracefully? By noon, it wasn't just a trending story. It had become a full-blown media storm. Major outlets dissected every second of the footage like it was a political debate. Some hosts called Ava a symbol of modern-day composure. Others accused the airline of mishandling the situation. A few voices, the loudest ones on late-night commentary shows, started twisting the story into controversy. Let's be honest, one pundit sneered. People are overreacting. It was just a seating mix-up. Why make it about race? Clips of that remark spread too, stirring up even more outrage. The airline North Air found itself in crisis mode. Inside its headquarters in Chicago, executives gathered in a glass-walled conference room, staring grimly at the news feeds. A PR manager scrolled through social media metrics. 78 million views in 24 hours, she said, and rising fast. The CEO of North Air slammed his palm on the table. "We can't afford another PR disaster. The video makes our crew look like they ignored bias on board." Another manager spoke nervously. The senior attendant handled it perfectly. But that younger one, she asked Ms. Williams to move. "People are calling it discrimination." "What's our plan?" someone asked. The PR manager hesitated. Damage control, public apology, statement of values, retraining initiative, make it sound heartfelt, the CEO snapped. "And find Ms. Williams. We need to reach out privately before she goes on camera." But Ava wasn't interested in being part of a PR campaign. That afternoon, her assistant received an email from North Air's corporate office offering an apology, a lifetime upgrade status, and partnership discussions. Ava read it once and smiled faintly. She could see what it really was, a polite attempt to smooth the edges of a billion-view problem. She closed her laptop and said quietly, "We don't need to respond yet." Meanwhile, the media frenzy kept boiling. On talk shows, guests debated whether the incident revealed deeper issues in travel culture. Hashtags like hashtag Flying Wild Black and hashtag Grace's Power flooded social platforms. Supporters of Ava began tagging North Air in their posts, demanding accountability. Others created fan pages, art, and even remixes of her famous line. By the third day, North Air couldn't stay silent any longer. The airline released an official statement. North Air deeply regrets the incident aboard Flight 228. We have reached out to Ms. Ava Williams to personally apologize and reaffirm our commitment to equality, respect, and fairness for all passengers. The employee involved has been temporarily reassigned pending further training. It sounded polished, too polished. Social media tore it apart within hours. Temporarily reassigned? That's it. Corporate words mean nothing without real change. Where's the sincerity? The public wasn't satisfied. Then, something unexpected happened. Ava finally agreed to a single interview, not with a mainstream outlet, but with a small independent podcast called The Leadership Lens. The host, a calm-voiced journalist named Erica Stone, opened gently. Ms. Williams, the world has seen your video millions of times. What do you want people to understand about that moment? Ava took a deep breath. That it wasn't about a seat, she said softly. It was about what happens when people assume who belongs where. Erica nodded. Did you expect the airline to respond the way it did? Ava smiled. They're protecting their image. I'm protecting my peace. I think we're both doing our jobs. The clip went viral again, but this time, not because of drama, because of wisdom. People quoted her line everywhere. They're protecting their image. I'm protecting my peace. It became a mantra for quiet strength in an age of outrage. Meanwhile, North Air realized they couldn't keep up with the momentum. The PR team proposed inviting Ava to speak at a corporate inclusion event as a gesture of partnership. Her assistant passed along the offer. Ava thought about it overnight. By morning, her answer was ready. She wrote a short, respectful reply. Thank you for the invitation. I believe growth starts with honesty, not optics. If your goal is real change, start by listening, not by inviting me to speak. That email, though private, leaked within hours. The internet exploded again. She turned down their offer, iconic. Integrity level, Ava Williams. She's teaching them more by saying no than 1,000 speeches could. At this point, even North Air employees began anonymously posting messages supporting her. A young pilot tweeted, She's right. We need listening sessions, not PR events. Facing mounting pressure, North Air announced a full-scale internal review of diversity and bias training and promised to include independent consultants. For the first time, it wasn't about headlines. It was about action. And yet, through it all, Ava remained calm. She didn't brag. She didn't gloat. She didn't post victory messages. She just continued her work, leading meetings, mentoring young entrepreneurs, building her company quietly as the world debated her story. One night, she sat by her apartment window overlooking the city lights, her phone lighting up with yet another interview request, this one from a major network offering a primetime feature. She thought for a long moment, then turned the phone face down. Her reflection in the glass looked tired, but peaceful. This isn't about fame, she whispered. It's about what people choose to learn. Down below, New York pulsed with life, cars, voices, movement. Yet in her silence, Ava had managed to make more noise than anyone shouting on television. A week later, North Air CEO finally appeared on camera, delivering a more genuine apology. He admitted the company's early response was insensitive and announced new equality protocols. Behind the scenes, a quiet credit went to Ava's dignity. Her composure had forced the corporation to change course, not through protest, but through presence. And as journalists analyzed her calmness, leadership experts began using her as a case study. One article titled The Ava Effect summed it up perfectly. In a world obsessed with outrage, Ava Williams reminded us that grace is the most disruptive power of all. She didn't ask for any of it, not the fame, not the hashtags, not the apologies. But she accepted one truth. Sometimes the world needs to see calm courage to remember its own humanity. And that, she realized, was a legacy worth leaving behind. One flight at a time. Night had fallen over Manhattan. And for the first time in weeks, the world wasn't talking about her. The hashtags had faded from the trending list. News outlets had moved on to the next viral controversy. And Ava finally had what she craved since that flight: silence. But silence has a strange way of revealing what noise hides. She sat by her window, a cup of chamomile tea in her hands, looking down at the endless city lights. Each one flickered like a heartbeat, constant yet distant, a mirror of her own exhaustion. It had been exactly 27 days since the flight. 27 days since she'd refused to move. Since she'd been insulted, filmed, praised, analyzed, and immortalized by strangers. And though the world saw her as a symbol of strength, she could finally admit, strength didn't mean she hadn't been shaken. Her assistant had cleared her schedule for the evening. No interviews, no meetings, no press requests. Just Ava, alone, trying to breathe again. She opened her laptop, scrolling through unread emails. Hundreds of messages still flooded her inbox every day. From fans, CEOs, teachers, and even teenage girls who said her video had inspired them to stand up to injustice in their own lives. One message caught her eye. It was from a young woman in Atlanta. Dear Ms. Williams, I watched your video when I was crying in my car after a job interview. They told me I didn't fit the image of their company. I almost gave up, but seeing you sit there with so much dignity, it changed something in me. I realize I don't have to shrink to fit. Thank you for sitting down so people like me could stand taller. Ava read it twice, her throat tightening. That simple letter reminded her of something she'd almost forgotten, the purpose behind the pain. She leaned back in her chair, whispering, maybe this was never about the flight. Maybe it was about the message. But the emotional toll was undeniable. She'd spent weeks being both celebrated and criticized by millions. Every expression she made on that plane had been dissected frame by frame, her tone analyzed, her race discussed, her patience praised. And while much it was love, there was also weight in being turned into a symbol. Symbols, after all, don't get to be human. They don't get to feel tired, or sad, or scared. They just exist for others to admire or attack. Ava sighed, running a hand through her hair. For days after the incident, she hadn't slept properly. Even now, she still replayed the confrontation in her mind. His voice, the disbelief, the people watching silently. The humiliation wasn't in losing the seat. It was in realizing how quickly people doubted her right to it. That truth cut deeper than any insult. She thought of Megan, the young flight attendant, her anxious eyes, her nervous suggestion that Ava should move just to avoid trouble. It wasn't hate. It was habit. A habit of assuming peace means surrender. Ava smiled sadly. That's what I've been fighting all my life, she whispered to herself. The world's comfort with my silence. She stood and walked over to her bookshelf, rows of books on leadership, psychology, and business. Her eyes fell on one of her old journals, worn and filled with pages of ambition. She flipped through it. On the first page, dated 5 years ago, she had written, leadership isn't about being loud. It's about being louder in purpose than in voice. She chuckled softly. Guess I lived that one, she said under her breath. Her phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from Ms. Lawson, the senior flight attendant who had defended her that night. Just wanted you to know, the company started new empathy training last week. Megan volunteered to lead one of the sessions. She told the class she learned everything she needed to from you, thought you'd like to know. Ava smiled, her eyes glistening. Sometimes, impact doesn't come from the loudest battles. Sometimes, it's one person changing quietly, because they saw grace and strength coexist in the same moment. Later that evening, Ava decided to go for a walk. The autumn air was crisp, the streets alive but calm. No one recognized her in her gray coat and beanie, and for once, she was grateful. As she crossed a small park, she saw a little girl sitting with her father on a bench, scrolling through a phone. The girl suddenly gasped. Daddy, that's the lady from the airplane. Her father looked up, startled, then smiled politely. Is that true? Ava hesitated for a second, then nodded gently. It's me. The little girl's eyes widened. You were so brave. Ava knelt down so she was eye level with her. You know what bravery really means? she asked. The girl shook her head. It means doing what's right even when it feels scary. Not to be louder than others, but to be true to yourself. The girl smiled, clutching her father's hand. I'll remember that. Ava stood, gave him a kind wave, and walked away, her heart full. She didn't realize until later how symbolic that moment was. A new generation learning from her strength, not her struggle. That night, back in her apartment, Ava sat at her desk again. The city's hum outside was steady, soothing. She opened a blank page in her journal and began to write. The world saw me as strong. But strength is what I showed on that plane. Strength is what came after. When the applause faded, the noise stopped, and I still chose peace. The hardest part isn't standing your ground. It's keeping your heart soft after the world tries to harden it. Her pen moved slowly, her thoughts flowing like a quiet stream. She realized that moment on the plane had changed her. Not just her reputation, but her entire understanding of leadership. True leadership, she realized, isn't about commanding attention. It's about modeling calm when the world expects chaos. It's about saying, I belong here, without shouting, and meaning it so deeply that even silence listens. Ava closed her journal, whispering a small prayer of gratitude. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't seeking justice or fame or validation. She'd already won something far greater, peace. Because peace doesn't come from the world treating you fairly. It comes from knowing who you are when it doesn't. And as she lay in bed that night, the city glowing faintly beyond her curtains, she smiled. The flight that had started as humiliation had become her greatest lesson. The man who had tried to take her seat had unknowingly handed her a platform, and the silence that followed had turned into her sanctuary. She whispered softly to herself before drifting to sleep. Grace is the quiet revolution the world never sees coming. And somewhere in that stillness, Ava finally found rest. Not as a viral figure, not as a CEO, but as a woman who had learned that the most powerful thing you can do is stay seated in your worth, in your truth, and in your peace. 2 months had passed since that unforgettable flight, and what began as a moment of humiliation had quietly evolved into a movement of reflection. Airline companies, corporations, and even schools had started using the incident as a case study, not for the drama, but for the lesson it carried. And at the center of it all was Ava Williams, the woman who refused to move. But Ava wasn't doing TV interviews anymore. She wasn't chasing headlines or giving motivational speeches in fancy halls. She was doing something far more powerful. She was rebuilding culture from within. It all began when the airline CEO reached out. His message was simple but sincere. Ms. Williams, we owe you an apology, but we also owe our employees education. Would you be willing to help us build something better? Ava stared at the email for a long time. Her first instinct was disbelief. Then came hesitation. Part of her wanted to delete it. The pain was still raw. How could she help the very system that had failed her? But then she remembered the letter from the young woman in Atlanta. And Megan, the flight attendant who had grown because of what she'd witnessed. That was when Ava realized. Real change doesn't happen when you walk away from broken systems. It happens when you walk back in, with grace, not bitterness. So, she replied with one line. Yes, but this time, we teach through empathy, not policy. 2 weeks later, she stood in a large conference room at the airline's headquarters. Executives, pilots, and flight attendants filled the seats, some curious, some skeptical. The same company that once allowed her to be humiliated now looked to her for wisdom. Ava took a deep breath and began, I didn't come here to shame anyone. I came here to start a conversation. She paused, letting her words settle. Then she asked softly, how many of you have ever made a decision just to keep the peace, even when it wasn't right? Almost every hand in the room went up. Ava nodded gently. That's the problem. We confuse comfort with peace. But peace isn't avoiding conflict. It's facing it with humanity. Her words resonated like quiet thunder. She shared her story not as a victim, but as a witness to what happens when bias goes unchecked, when silence replaces courage, and when someone's dignity is treated as a debate. Over the next few months, Ava collaborated with the airline's training team to build a new program called Empathy in the Air. It wasn't just another corporate slideshow filled with buzzwords. It was personal, real, transformative. The sessions included role-play exercises, listening circles, and honest discussions about bias, privilege, and perception. And the most powerful part? Ava didn't lecture, she listened. She let crew members speak about the fears they carried, of being judged, misunderstood, or blamed. She reminded them that empathy wasn't about guilt. It was about awareness. Megan, the flight attendant from that day, became one of Ava's closest collaborators. She had grown immensely since that flight. In one session, Megan stood in front of a group of trainees and said, "That day, I thought asking Ms. Williams to move would fix the problem. But I learned something. Peace built on silence isn't peace, it's pressure." The room went still. Ava smiled proudly from the back, realizing that transformation had already begun. As months passed, the results were undeniable. Complaints of discriminatory incidents dropped significantly. Customer satisfaction improved. And word spread beyond the airline industry. Universities started reaching out to Ava for workshops. Companies began implementing her empathy framework. She even received an invitation from the United Nations to speak about emotional intelligence in leadership. But Ava never let the fame define her. When reporters asked if she felt vindicated, she replied simply, "Vindication was never the goal. Awareness was." Her calmness had become her trademark, her stillness, her superpower. One morning, she received an email from the man who had taken her seat. The subject line read, "I owe you more than an apology." Ava hesitated before opening it. Her heart pounded as she read, "Ms. Williams, I've spent months replaying that day in my head. I saw a woman who carried herself with grace while I carried myself with arrogance. You didn't humiliate me. You exposed me to myself. I've started volunteering at a local youth mentorship program. Because of you, I want to thank you for not standing up." Ava exhaled deeply, tears filling her eyes. She didn't know if forgiveness could erase the past, but it could certainly redeem the future. Later that year, the airline invited Ava to an annual conference where they unveiled a new initiative in her honor, the Ava Williams Integrity Award, given to employees who demonstrated courage with compassion. When they called her to the stage, the audience rose to their feet, applauding for several minutes. But Ava didn't bask in it. She simply smiled and said, "I didn't change the world. I just didn't move." The applause grew louder. After the event, she stood outside on the airport tarmac, watching planes soar into the night sky, their lights cutting through clouds like tiny constellations of hope. She thought about all the people who had been touched by her story. The little girl in the park, Megan, the man who apologized, the woman in Atlanta, and countless others she'd never meet. Each of them had become part of something much bigger, proof that dignity can be contagious. She whispered softly, "Maybe all I ever needed to do was stay seated long enough for the world to stand taller." That night, as she rode home, Ava looked out the window of her car, watching the lights blur against the glass. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a mirror, one that had shown the world both its flaws and its potential. And for the first time since that flight, she allowed herself to smile without restraint, because now she understood the full circle of her journey. It wasn't about reclaiming a seat on a plane. It was about reminding humanity that respect has no class, color, or category. It's simply the right of being human. And with that, Ava closed her eyes, letting the rhythm of the road lull her into a peaceful silence. The kind of silence that doesn't come from fear, but from freedom. It had been exactly 1 year since that flight. 1 year since Ava Williams' calm refusal to move became a global symbol of quiet strength. The world had changed in small but meaningful ways. Her story was now taught in universities under ethical leadership and emotional intelligence. Airlines had integrated empathy training into their onboarding programs. And across social media, thousands of people use the hashtag #StaySeated, not as defiance, but as a promise to stand firm in dignity and truth. But to Ava, the most beautiful change wasn't in policies or press releases. It was in people. She saw it every day. Strangers holding the door for one another, speaking up when someone was disrespected, choosing compassion over convenience. She'd always believed change began with a conversation. Now, She was living proof that sometimes it begins with silence. On a cool spring morning, Ava stood at the entrance of a community center in her old neighborhood. She was hosting her first youth program, Seats of Strength. The idea was simple. Teach young people that leadership doesn't start when you get power. It starts when you refuse to give up your place in the world. Inside the center, the walls were filled with colorful posters of inspiring figures. Rosa Parks, Nelson Mandela, Maya Angelou, and right beside them, someone had pinned a newspaper clipping of Ava herself sitting on that flight, eyes calm, back straight. It still felt surreal. She smiled as children ran past her, laughing, their voices echoing through the hall. They didn't know her as the CEO from a viral video. To them, she was Miss Ava, the lady who told stories that made them believe in themselves. During one of the sessions, a little boy raised his hand and asked, "Miss Ava, why didn't you just get angry at that man?" The room fell silent. Ava crouched down so she could look him in the eyes. "Because sometimes anger gives them control," she said softly. "But calm makes them listen." The boy nodded slowly, absorbing every word. Ava smiled and added, "The world doesn't need more loud people. It needs people whose peace is louder than injustice." The room erupted in quiet applause. That was Ava's gift. She didn't shout lessons. She breathed them. That evening, after the workshop ended, Ava sat on the steps outside the center, watching the sunset. Golden light spilled across the city, wrapping everything in warmth. Her phone buzzed. It was Megan, her friend, her student, her proof that people can change. "Hey, boss," the text read. "Just want to say I finished my degree in diversity management today. None of this would have happened without you." Ava grinned, typing back, "You did it, Megan. You stayed seated. And now look how far you've gone." She set her phone down, her eyes misty with pride. That one text summed up everything she'd been working toward. Not fame, not recognition, transformation. Later that week, Ava was invited to deliver a keynote speech at an international leadership summit in Geneva. Her talk was titled "The Power of Stillness." The auditorium was filled with leaders, CEOs, activists, and journalists from around the world. When Ava walked on the stage, the entire audience rose in applause. But she simply raised her hand and smiled. "Thank you," she began. "But today, I don't want to talk about the flight. I want to talk about the flight after flight, the one we're all still on." The audience leaned in. We live in a world that rewards loudness, loud opinions, loud anger, loud pride. But I learned something sitting in that seat. True power doesn't need volume. It needs presence. Leadership isn't about how high you stand. It's about how deeply you're seated, in your values, your peace, and your self-worth. She paused, letting the silence breathe between her words. That day on the plane, I didn't refuse to move out of stubbornness. I refused to move because I was tired of generations being told to shrink. I stayed seated for every woman who was told she was too strong, for every person of color told they didn't belong, for every human being who forgot their own worth. The hall was utterly silent. Some people were in tears. Ava smiled softly. "And if you remember one thing from me, let it be this. Never move just to make someone else comfortable. Stay seated in your truth. That's where real change begins." The audience erupted in applause that went on for minutes. But for Ava, the loudest sound was still the quiet pride in her heart. Weeks later, back home, Ava sat by her window again. The same window she'd sat by on that lonely night months ago when everything had felt heavy. But tonight was different. Tonight, she wasn't tired. She was fulfilled. On her coffee table lay a framed photo. Her sitting with a group of kids from her workshop, all holding a small card that read, "My seat, my worth." She picked up her journal, the same one she'd written in after the flight, and opened to a fresh page. She wrote slowly, carefully, "A year ago, I thought I lost a seat on a plane. Now I realize I claimed a place in history. Not because I stood up, but because I didn't." She closed the journal and smiled to herself. A few days later, while traveling again for work, Ava boarded another flight, her first since that day. The moment she stepped onto the plane, the cabin crew recognized her instantly. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Williams," said the attendant warmly. "It's an honor to have you." Ava smiled kindly. "It's good to be back." As she made her way down the aisle, passengers whispered, some smiling, some applauding quietly. And then she saw it, C14A, the same number as the one from a year ago. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at it. The past flashed before her, the tension, the humiliation, the courage. Then she exhaled softly and sat down. This time, the air felt lighter. The world felt different. As the plane began to take off, Ava looked out the window at the rising clouds. Her reflection stared back at her, calm, content, and finally free. She whispered to herself, "Sometimes the seat you fight to keep becomes a seat that changes a world." And with that, the engines roared, the ground fell away, and Ava Williams, the woman who once refused to move, soared higher than she'd ever been before.